Hi, I'm Tim Lennon, Executive Director at Langston.
And I'm Jasmine Scott, the Program Manager at Langston. And I'm here to welcome you to the 18th Annual Seattle Black Film Festival, our second fully online festival.
We look forward to rejoining you here in person soon at the Langston Hughes Performing Arts Institute in Seattle's Central District. For now, stay healthy, get vaccinated, and enjoy all the programs we have to offer online.
We're so excited to launch this year's festival on a brand new platform, and we've added a ton of video on demand options as well as timed events for you to enjoy. So we're so glad that you could join us again virtually this year for the festival. If you'd like to learn more about the Seattle Black Film Festival, about Langston, about all of our other programs, or to donate in support of our programs, please visit langstonseattle.org.
On behalf of the Langston family, I want to thank our sponsors and each and every one of you for joining us here for this year's film festival. Enjoy the show.
Enjoy.
Welcome to Seattle Black Film Festival 2021. I'm Festival Director Andrea Stuart-Lehalle.
And I'm Zola Mumford, Festival Curator.
You made it. You're here, and we're so glad you joined us.
This year, we're excited to share over 70 films from across the diaspora, telling stories that elevate Black cinematic brilliance. Our stories? Stories that speak our truth.
Before we get started, here are a few notes about this year's festival.
This year, we are fully online, so you don't even have to leave your home to catch some of the best new films in Black independent cinema.
Please assume that any films in this year's festival may include mature content. Please do your best to make your own choices about what might be appropriate for you.
Also, we've done our best to deliver an accessible festival, so some of our films do feature closed captioning or subtitles.
A huge thank you to Langston and our entire filmmaking community and filmmakers of this year's official selection. We are so excited. Have a great festival.
And thank you for joining us for Seattle Black Film Festival 2021.
Welcome to Seattle Black Film Festival 2021. We hope that you have been enjoying our video on demand selection that'll be available through April 26th, and we are so happy that you decided to join us this afternoon. Today, we'll be having a conversation around a diaspora in displacement, one of our festival themes this year. We are so honored to be joined by Davida Ingram, who will be leading this conversation with our community today. Just in case you haven't had a chance to check out Langston, Seattle.org/SBFF, you can find all information about tickets and programming there. Thank you so much again for joining us. Davida, please take it away.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Seattle Black Film Festival. My name is Davida Ingram, and I am the artist who works to create space for Black and Brown communities to have vibrant cultural space here in Seattle. I'm also the Public Engagement Programs Manager at the Seattle Public Library and a proud supporter of the Seattle Black Film Festival and the legacy of cultural work that it stands for. Before we begin this really amazing conversation, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous ancestral lands. Every place in the United States is Indigenous land. Specifically in Seattle, we are on the lands of the Duwamish people. These lands also have ancestral and cultural significance to Coast Salish peoples such as the Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and Tulalip tribes. We also extend love and connection to all of our Indigenous relatives. As an African American, I understand that my ancestors and I are unexpected guests on these lands. Both Native and Black people are contending with the violent after effects of settler colonialism. So much of today's conversation will be with that history in mind, and also the solidarities that Black and Native people have held and can have with one another, and with our fellow Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, also known as BIPOC, as we weather the COVID pandemic and its disproportionate impact on communities of color. What comes to mind for me is our intentional investment in Indigenous sovereignty and also challenging Indigenous erasure, to think about Black joy and Black liberation, and also the practices of cultural preservation and ways to honor all survivors of colonization in the Americas, Africa, Asia, the Pacific Islands, and beyond. I am beyond honored to join this conversation with amazing leaders in our Puget Sound communities who are leading conversations and advocacy around social and economic justice for Black and Indigenous people, particularly when it comes to land rights and access to food and shelter. So when we say land back, when we say challenging gentrification, where do we want to go? Let's get started. So today I'm joined by Elisheba Johnson and Sauncha Romey and Gardheere of the Seattle Office for Planning and Community Development. Elisheba, of course, is with Wari. I'd like each of you to start by introducing yourselves and say your name, say your pronouns, say who you rep for, who claims you, who you're claiming. And let's, if it's okay, can we start with Elisheba and then go to Sauncha and Ubax?
Thank you, Davida. I'm Elisheba Johnson. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. I am a Black artist and mother in Seattle, Washington, born and raised. And me and three friends, all artists, started Wari 2 years ago. It was 2 years ago on April 5th. Wari started as a social practice experiment where we as artists rented a historically Black-owned home and give it back to the Black community as an arts and cultural center. Right now, we're raising funds to buy the home and make it a permanent center in Seattle's Central District. And I can talk more about that work as we talk in the panel today. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Elisheba. Passing it to Sauncha and then Ubax.
Hi, I'm Sauncha. I'm Simshan from Metlakatla, Alaska. I live in Bonnie Lake, Washington now because it's what I could afford. I currently have an internship at the City of Seattle Office of Planning and Community Development in the EDI department as the Indigenous intern. My day job is over at the KCLS library, where I do a lot of DEI work. I'm on the committee there. And then I started a POC and LGBTQ committee on the union. I'm working on my master's in public administration with a tribal and social justice focus at Evergreen, and still finishing up my second bachelor's at Northwest Indian College. That's it.
All that brilliance in the house. Ubax.
Thank you, Davida. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Ubax Gardheere. My daytime job, 9 to 5, economic job, as I call it, is with the Office of Planning and Community Development. I am the Equitable Development Director. The Equitable Development is a new initiative with the dual purpose of mitigating displacement and increasing access to opportunity with Seattle's most marginalized communities. I go by she, her, hers. I'm Black, African descent. I'm also a mother of 3 beautiful, very energetic human beings, and glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. We're about to dive in, and it began, and I'm really interested how you all want to enter the conversation. But we kind of began by saying you really can't talk about the United States without talking about displacement, because if you think of attempts at mass genocide, when we think about the human trafficking that happened with European slavers, that all of that is 600, 400 years worth of displacement. So the opposite side of that is talking about belonging. So when you think about that push and pull of belonging and displacement and the impact of gentrification, what solutions do you want to see on the horizon, or what do you see on the horizon? And what are the persistent challenges? And that's a deep, meaty question, but I was wondering, Sauncha, if you're okay, I would love to begin with you and then pass it to Elisheba and then close it out with Uba, if that's okay.
Yeah, and it is such an important issue to Native communities. We're tied to the land. Like, our worldview is relational, relation to each other, relation as a Native person, our relation to the land. I'm still tied to my land back in Metlakatla, Alaska. I still call it my island. And people are like, why are you calling it your island? Are you a millionaire? I'm like, that's my home. Like, when I dream, that's where I dream I'm at. And the trauma that comes with leaving that space for economic development it was one of the hardest decisions of my life, and that I live with every day. And so we see that in the city of Seattle. I'm kind of working on the comprehensive plan, and I'm like, one of the ways we can acknowledge Native communities is acknowledging the straightening of the Duwamish River and the trauma that had, the making of the Ship Canal Bridge and the lowering of the Black River that dried it up. Those are hugely traumatic events for those communities that dried up food sources and pushed them out of the city of Seattle as well.
I think I'll just jump in after Sauncha and say, communities of color have always been innovative, right? Like, and I think that people forget that, they get amnesia, but like there is, I don't even want to call it lore, but like the oral histories in my family of my ancestors who moved around and migrated for better opportunities and then made ways for Black people. I think we're always doing that, right? So if you look at the Central District in particular, which I assume everybody who's watching today knows is Seattle's historically redlined neighborhood, which was the only neighborhood that Black folks were allowed to buy property, and also Asian American folks and some Jewish folks as well. I want to acknowledge that as we're talking about solidarity as well. But there's been organizing in the community for over 30 years. And what's been really exciting at this moment is that you see things like the Liberty Bank building, which is a project of Africatown. And then there's Jackson Heights building that are welcoming Black families back into the neighborhood. You see the Fire Station 9 building has been given back to the community, which is something people have been organizing for 20 years. So I think that I'm really excited about the future of the Central area. I always say it's not going to be a historically redlined neighborhood anymore, but it will be a multicultural neighborhood. And I think that we should really think about what that means as we come out of COVID. And if we could free ourselves from capitalism for just a minute and actually think about what it would mean for all of us to share space equitably. And that's what I would like to see in the Central District.
Thank you. I feel like I was set up to follow those two. But I like starting by talking about how land ownership has been highly consolidated as well as racialized. Again, due to the long history of genocide that folks have mentioned, or redlining, or restrictive covenant, disposition, slavery in this country. And looking at our historical context exposes how the rules that govern our relationship to land were constructed, but by whom? They were not given, they are not natural laws. They were constructed by white colonialists. Individual ownership was not the norm in Africa, where I'm from, or on the Taro Island. And I believe that land was always recognized as belonging to the community or not belonging to anyone. But it was something that you can live alongside and with. But we know that as our region, our country started building, private property laws were created again by the European colonialists, and they were used to establish and maintain systems of racial and economic subordination of Black and Indigenous people. For example, in Seattle, where I work, when Seattle was initially incorporated in about 1865, there was an ordinance that was introduced, Ordinance Number 5, which prohibited Native American people from living in Seattle. And so for me, I think looking at that history, followed by the widespread disinvestment in BIPOC communities, specifically Black and Indigenous communities, I look at land and the work I'm doing as how do you create or facilitate land ownership, or I think this is really something that freaks people out, but land reparations. And I think I am kind of contributing a little bit to that, to the work I'm doing with the City of Seattle. The Equitable Development Initiative was born out of an inside-outside strategy with community in Africatown Land Trust, Black Community Impact Alliance, the community groups in CID, Chinatown ID, the Black and immigrants in Rainier Valley, all coming together across neighborhoods to organize and advocate for investments in their communities as they were seeing their communities being displaced, and asking us to pull together a program that benefits these groups and kind of facilitates and contributes to ownership of land and resources and capacity building, because these communities have been left out of those kind of development, and they didn't own land and things like that. So in a very little way, I tell myself as I wake up in the morning and go to work that at least I'm contributing towards getting land out of the speculative market and under community control and ownership.
Y'all are on fire. I'm loving this conversation. I want to plot a few points for us, and then we're going to dive in. The word belonging can mean different things, right? So if I ask, who do you belong to? You might think of, your family, the folks that claim you. And then there's belonging in the notion of an object, and also under capitalism, the notion of owning. I do believe when we understand Indigenous knowledge systems that it exceeds capitalism, in that sense that we belong to the land, right? Not that the land belongs to us. So when we began to think about belonging and displacement, and also kind of keeping in mind that oftentimes in the context of Indigenous and Black relationships in the United States, how do we belong to one another after 400 years of contact? Do we have formal ways of doing protocol so that we can show up for one another in thoughtful ways? So when we think about belonging and the impact of displacement and gentrification, moving a little bit deeper into the space of seeing and showing up for one another, how does inequity happen by design in Seattle and other communities that are nearby? And what are some of the ways you see communities of color reclaiming space in the United States? Also, are there any particularly exciting and ingenious ways that community organizers are challenging the system? So again, we're thinking about belonging vividly, rigorously, and naming some things that we're excited to see, and also the ways that folks are challenging the status quo in meaningful ways. And that's a big question, so I don't want to put anybody on the spot. But I was going to see if Elisheba would go, and then we'll pass it on to other panelists.
That was 3 questions in one question.
I know. It's a meta question. It was a meta question. We just jumped on in.
So there was a question about how to you got to do it again.
Okay, so and inside of that question is, how can Native and Black people belong to one another? How can we think differently about the notion of belonging when it comes to land rights? And who's doing that well? Who's doing that in a way that's exciting for you, that you're like, yeah, that's a 21st century model that we should get with and think about? But the intentionality around Black and Native folks, just on the library side of things, that's a big body of work, mostly because we're doing food justice work. And I would like us to have a relationship to the land that connects us back to one another in dope ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think both communities have an inherent relationship to the land, but actually all humans do, like, if we're going to be honest about that. But I think about, how Black folks after slavery, did their own farming and stuff out of Reconstruction. So I think we all have like a embodied relationship to the land. I don't have like an easy answer. I think that I'm part of organizing bodies that include, Black folks, Indigenous folks, Asian folks, Pacific Islander folks, et cetera, Latinx folks. But like to really, and we're thinking about how we strengthen that bond at Wari intentionally, because we know that we can't really talk about displacement of Black people without acknowledging that the land was taken from Indigenous folks, right? And so we feel like that conversation always needs to be had, and one that we're trying to understand as we do the work. Also, there are Black and Indigenous folks, right? So we have curated some intentionally to have a conversation around what does it mean to be Black and Indigenous in this country. So I think that's a question that's more evolving for me, that I'm still learning on. How do we work together in solidarity for what we both believe in, which is land back, right? How do we get land reparations? I think there's really exciting things happening all over the country. In Oregon, there's a group that's organizing, of course, I can't think of the name right now, that they're asking for basically for reparations to buy land that will be for cooperative housing. I remember in the Bay Area, I think it was at the beginning of quarantine, a bunch of mothers were getting evicted and they organized and kind of held down these houses, and then they were able to kind of get a lease. So I think people are actually standing up in this moment all over the country in different ways and really kind of saying like, everybody has a right to live and exist and have housing, and how do we kind of think of creative ways to fight back against capitalism?
Fantastic. So Elisheba just dove right in. Sauncha, Uba, knowing that the question is layered, how would you want to dive in and begin to answer it?
I can start by, I don't know, sometimes I just make gentrification about, like, kind of like towards, think about the academics of it. But sometimes, I mean, like when I think about gentrification, if the people who live in a neighborhood benefit, it's not a bad thing, right? And sometimes it might not cause direct displacement, but we know that the gentrification that has been happening in Seattle, anywhere in the country or internationally, displaces people, and especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And this displacement, I believe, foreshadows a slower demographic turnover. Because for me, a sense of belonging, I always feel that I belong when I'm with my village, people that look like me, And I think when displacement starts happening in a neighborhood, it can cause fear, it can cause alienation and other tensions that erode community ties, right? So like that village that you've created in this neighborhood, which initially you didn't even pick, right? You were like forced into it because of either redlining or, restrictive covenants. And because you were forced into it, you created your own village, your own homes, your own cultural anchors. And then all of a sudden, when it becomes desirable and you can't afford to live there anymore, and then this community, this village, this sense of belonging is shattered. So I think, as I said earlier, I'm an immigrant who was raised in a place that everybody looked like me, right? My principal looked like me, my president looked like me, everybody looked like me. And that gives you like a sense of belonging where like, like you don't think like you don't belong anymore, right? But I have a 15-year-old now that when he was 5 years old, he never felt like he belonged in elementary school or in middle school, or now that he's in high school, he doesn't feel that he belongs at all because nobody looks like him. And he has never had a teacher that looks like him, and I don't know where I'm going with this, but I was just thinking about how their sense of belonging and displacement and gentrification are linked, and people who are either connected to us, and even at work, right? For example, I feel like I've created a community, a village within my team who we all, get each other. We all like, and are building towards a theory of change and believe in the same values that, again, goes back to what I said earlier. I do this work to make sure that communities of color benefit from this region's economic transformation. And what does it mean to create belonging in organizations, in your own team, in movements, and what are you making specific invitations and what does belonging look like is what I'm thinking about. And where I'm going with this is, I think, let's look at what happened this summer there in racial reckoning that and was happening here. And I was very just like seeing when people came together across race, to really come outside and talk about defunding the police, talk about, transferring land to in the Black communities in Central District, for example. And they all came in there with one voice, with a specific ask of undoing past harms, and really felt a sense of, I felt like a sense of, where am I going with this? Like really inspired. I felt inspired just seeing, especially young, predominantly Black youth, coming together and really pressuring the city to do the right thing, and coming up with, the King County Equity Now, or if it's the Black Brilliance folks. I don't want to use other examples in other states, because like for me, what inspired me is seeing this young Black leaders actually kind of taking the driver's seat and saying, this is the solutions. This is what we need to see. We need to see you guys investing in community ownership. We need to see you and the city, and investing in the Black community, in home ownerships, in, everything that was never given to this community, not even given, like, and that they didn't have access to. So I think for me, the example of like folks that I'm looking up to and I see that are doing amazing stuff, even though sometimes, there's conflicts and things like that, but that comes with, family growing together in every village.
That's real.
Conflict and everything, but I think I'm like really inspired by what the King County Equity Now, the Black Brilliance folks, the work that Wari is doing, the work that a lot of the Black and Indigenous communities who stepped up to really be the village that we needed at this time is the examples that I wanted to use.
Awesome. Sauncha,
Yeah.
we want to hear your voice.
Yeah, so belonging is such an important issue to me because there are so few Native Americans around. I have worked at the library for 12 years and I have never seen a coworker of my race. And that incredible loneliness of day in and day out, that whiteness. And as a light-skinned Native person, some people are like, I don't get it. What do you have to do? We think you're just normal, And so the way I try to tell them is like the second I walk in that door, I am thinking, what would a white person do? What would a white person do? What would a white person do? To try to keep myself to following all the rules and not get in trouble, because even though I'm not a dark-skinned person of color, it doesn't mean that my managers aren't weaponizing my experience, and I do have to hold myself to a different standard. And so like for me, true belonging that I didn't even know I could have was when I went to Northwest Indian College, and I was so shocked to be there. I didn't think I could be in an academic setting with Indigenous students, teachers, textbooks, methodologies, and an institution. I didn't have to watch what I said because they wouldn't believe what happened. Like, they're like, oh yeah, we know that happens. So I was able to freely speak up in class without deciding, is that going to be too much emotional labor? Is somebody in this class going to challenge me on it because they think that wouldn't possibly be real? And it took being there to realize the harm that I experienced at UW. And I guess when we get to issues of how do people of color come together is when I moved down here from Alaska, I had a healthy dose of colorblind racism. I grew up on an island in Alaska with white teachers and white textbooks. Like, where was I supposed to get this Native education, even in my reservation island? And so even the good teachers, these are the good ones, told me, get an education, go to college, and never look back. And so that instilled into me that there was nothing of value on my island. Like, it's a difficult place to live with no Amazon, one grocery store that closes at 4 p.m., but it's an incredibly rich and vibrant community. And it took me going to Northwest Indian College, learning Indigenous methodologies, and to really be transformed there. And I didn't know I could feel that way. And that has made me a more whole person. It's actually prepared me for anti-racism battles. I've got books now to cite, white people, if it's not written in a book, it's not real. And so I do think K through 12 education is one of the ways that we are held down everywhere. Like, that was my experience on my island. We did not have a culturally relevant education. I clawed my way through a Western positivism paradigm, but that should not have been the option. I should have had a culturally relevant education, and mediocrity shouldn't just be the right of white students. It shouldn't take an exceptionalism, perfectionist person who was always one step away from not making it. And I do know that it was my light skin that gave me many advantages when I was like a step away from homelessness, a step away from not being able to pay tuition. And they looked at my skin color and assumed I was white and gave me a pass. I fully acknowledge that. I would never say that it was 100% my hard work that got there. But I also think my classmates should have been able to be a human being and go to college and make mistakes and not end up homeless. We do need to fix that K through 12 education. Without it, we can fall right back into the divide and conquer. And it's the colonizer's favorite method. If you can pit Black people against Native people, or against Asian people, or even Native against Native people, or even that internalized racism where we judge people who didn't make it, which is why I'm always trying to be very cognizant of the privileges that I have, even with all the difficulty. So yeah, we need to start busting those down. Police brutality isn't just a Black person thing. I mean, the guy that killed George Floyd also killed a Native person, or at least shot them. I can't remember right now. And, there was the John T. Williams shooting here in Seattle. These are issues that affect all of us. And I think we need accurate K through 12 Native education. And Black education. Like these are, like Robin DeAngelo's, like these histories didn't happen in a vacuum. They're not Black history and they're not Native history. We didn't create those histories. That is white history. And I'm really excited about like the ethnic studies that Jesse, okay, if he's watching, or somebody knows, I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, but Jesse Hogopian from the Seattle School.
Yeah.
And John Greenberg, who really pushed for those, the ethnic study classes. I saw them present at the White Privilege Conference maybe 2 years ago. And me and my daughter, we were like, we need to step up our anti-racism game. Like they made us seem like we were knitting. And I've got like a full troublemaker label. And I was like, I have nothing compared to them. So I'm really excited to see them. But like, if we had accurate ethnic studies in our schools, it's better for the students. It's better for white people. I push for that for like, I love tribal colleges and they get a bad rap. Like people act like they're not academic. And I'm like, they taught me how to be a troublemaker, not UW. UW taught me how to be white. My work is terrified of me because of my education at Northwest Indian College. Evergreen is terrified of what I bring from Northwest Indian College. And it's like kids that go to tribal college for 2 years, they're 4 times more likely to graduate from a 4-year university when they go. Ethnic studies has such amazing quantifiable, just that half credit class can increase GPAs by 1.4 points. It can reduce truancy by 22%. And among Latino males, it brings their national dropout rate of 56% down to 2.5%. And I'm like, how can you argue with that half credit class? And people do. So I hope that.
What I've noticed in the conversation is that you all are moving so fluidly between history and memory, and also so fluidly between cultural specificity and then cross-cultural exchange, which brings us to solidarity. So with that in mind, what is the connection between justice, and I want to invite you to include your culturally specific understandings of justice, because justice under Western logic sometimes doesn't look just, and then culture and community building, because in that question is our ability to create, nurture, and sustain our own cultural spaces. So I'm really interested, again, what is the connection between justice, culture, and community building and our ability to create, nurture, and sustain our own cultural spaces? Yeah.
So I really look to the work coming out of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It is so amazing. And so often we hear, even from our own Native communities, that we should just let go of the past and just carry on. And there's like a lot of stuff that happened there. And so Canada has approached it with like, they're like, all right, we're going to have to do a truth. We're going to have to do a fact-finding, like massive 7-year effort to document what happened in boarding schools, which boarding schools happened here in the US too. My grandmother went to the Sitka boarding school, and that carried over into my parents' trauma and the trauma of people that abused me when I was a child. That is not ancient history. Like it hasn't even had a chance really to become generational trauma because people are still alive who went to those schools. They shut down in the 90s. So Canada had their Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It started out of a massive lawsuit of survivors. And normally when you do a settlement, there's a non-disclosure agreement, but they wanted people to have their day in court. So they went on this 7-year talking circle fact-finding around the country. And of course, when we talk about boarding schools in the US, and they had these stories too before they did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is that some people had a good time at boarding schools. Just think of what you gained. And they were finding out there were entire schools where there was never a head person who hadn't been convicted of sexual assault. And it's like tens to hundreds of thousands of Native people were sexually abused. And before that commission happened, they were just like, oh, it's just some people. So they had talking circles around the country. At first, like the churches were showing up because the churches ran the boarding schools. And these are well-meaning white people. Like that's how it kind of started, questionably, although I think they definitely wanted to get rid of us too. But at the first talking circles, like the priests were like, oh, but think of what you guys gained. And they were getting booed. And so it took them a few talking circles to stop that. Like they're like, okay, a lot more happened than we knew because nobody was asking and nobody was writing it down and recording it. So they did 7 years. They made this amazing report that really goes into all of the aspects of the systematic racism of Native people, how it leads to, dropout rates and their own continuation of abusing other people and how it leads to prison. But they were also like, there's ways we can fix this and we should do it. So out of the commission, they're like, we're going to revamp our K through 12 education. We need to be taught this history. We can't just ignore it. You can't get to truth and reconciliation without the truth. And they revamped their systems. They've invested heavily in the arts, which I think arts is one of the ways to stop this trauma and to combat invisibility bias. There are so many people who don't even think Native people even exist today. And if they do think we exist, they are stuck in that historical 1800s, like Hollywood Indian stereotype. So I love the modern art too, coming out of Canada. They've invested heavily in the Native arts. They have their own TV station that's funded by Canadian money. The Indigenous Vancouver Fashion Festival is funded by the government. A tribe called Red, Snotty-Nosed Res Kids. If you watch the end of those videos, me and my daughter know, we're like, watch, it's going to say Canadian arts, and it is. And I work at the library, and you've probably seen those demographics where they're like, there's like less than 1% of books are Native Americans, and a whole bunch came out. Like they were like, check these out, and they were like 95% coming out of Canada with that arts funding. So,
really pointing us towards policy. Okay. Uba, would you like to add, and then we'll circle back to Elisheba?
Yes. I actually, I admire folks who can, innovate with arts and culture. And I wanna answer that question with using equitable development as a lens, because I think we know that arts and culture can be seen both as an agent of or a subject of both displacement and gentrification, right? Without equitable development lens. And what do I mean by that? Equitable development, to me, is the place-based manifestation of racial equity. And it's both a process as well as an outcome. And the desired outcome of equitable development, if we do it right, is the establishment of a thriving communities of opportunity that are actually characterized by, the word that you used around justice, but also earlier you asked about inclusion. So characterized by both in justice and fair inclusion. To me, also equitable development, one of the equity drivers of equitable development is building on the local cultural assets of communities most marginalized, right? And that means building power towards equity solutions, building and working towards capacity for local leaders who already been doing this work. That's why the Equitable Development Fund has both capacity building component as well as a brick and mortar project development component. And then just working with the residents of specific neighborhoods, because equitable development is place-based. So and working with these residents to actually drive resources. That's why earlier I was excited about this participatory budgeting idea that at the time KCN and the Black Brilliance folks actually forced the city to do something about investing in participatory budgeting, because in expanding capacity for local leaders as well as residents means that we are driving resources to improve the quality of life in these underinvested communities, right? In Seattle, in EDI in Seattle, we focus in high-risk displacement neighborhoods, which of course have also suffered widespread disinvestment. They're like in historically red line neighborhoods. and some of them got in recent infrastructure and transportation improvement, and instead of them benefiting from that, it's actually doing the opposite and impacting them and leading to displacement. So where arts comes into this is arts and culture can be used to engage community and leverage those outcomes that I'm talking about. And partnering with and integrating arts and culture into community development, I think, is what leads to a more thriving society. So, and I don't even know what question I was answering, but I think I wanted to kind of like talk about how arts and culture shows up in equitable development. And again, it goes back to this kind of like the question you asked earlier about belonging. If people are moving a policy or moving a project in a way that they recognize and have a shared values and practices and that shape the quality of lives of these groups, then I think that these art forms expressions and whether it is performing. I come from Somalia. It's known for being the nation of poets, right? And you can just like meet a Somali person and either use a metaphor or a poem, and then all of a sudden you feel like this person is already family, right? That's like, again, where you guys meet. Or whether it's like looking at culture through what the landscape looks like or things like that. For example, in one of the panelists earlier was talking about Liberty Bank, or even looking at the other project in Central District. What does it look like using African landscape, that embodies the culture of and reflects, informs, and explains in this culture? What would that look like? And then who's going to be able to actually do something like that, right? You have to, like, if earlier you were talking about how like you're educated to like really be like towards the white culture, right? So it's even hard to find somebody who will be able to like and do the landscape that brings these cultural components in an African descent building, right? So again, and then the other thing is like looking at public spaces and this art manifestation of the places where people have seen themselves, have seen their ancestors. And I think in order to be able to advance racial equity outcomes, I think integrating arts and culture with equitable development lens is one of the ways to.
Word. Okay. Before we have you do your closing thoughts, I want to hear, because what powerful words from Uba and Sauncha around how we can create and own in a powerful collective sense cultural spaces. How would you want to wind that conversation down, Elisheba?
I go around proselytizing the power of art all the time, so I'm right there with you, Uba. And that's kind of what my whole career has been around, creating art spaces where people can find belonging, and using those spaces as community hubs and anchors. And so that is what me and my friends and collaborators have done, or have attempted to do at Wari, is really think about, and it was mentioned earlier that one of the byproducts of gentrification and displacement is that people are disconnected from their neighborhoods and the land and their communities, right? And so that maybe you move to Kent or Everett or wherever, but you still come back to the Central District, even though a lot of these markers and places are gone. And we are really trying to build a compound, so to speak. And that's probably not a good word to use, but we have a big yard between two houses that are all being used to function for the growth and prosperity of Black people and people of color. in that neighborhood, and we're hoping to keep growing and expanding. But yeah, I just agree with you that arts and culture are the tools that I use to get people in their heart space to be moved. You talked about justice, but as a former city employee, and democratic socialist, and abolitionist, I know that change happens really, really slowly. So it's not that I don't think in a justice framework, but I'm constantly kind of thinking way in the future of like, what do I want this community to look like? And I know that it's going to take many, many years and many, many people to make that happen. And that's kind of the work that I think all of us are really doing is, what does it look like for everybody to have access to the land, to be able to feel like they belong here, and that should be something that's embodied. And I think that if America can get to a place where we all feel like we belong here, that would be great. So that's going to be my closing thought.
Well, we might ask you for two because we're not quite doing closing thoughts. But let me tee some things up for us. Because one, I'm thinking about the audience for the Seattle Black Film Festival. So the program that they're going to look at is called Diaspora and Displacement. And I think for many people listening in on the Seattle conversation, it's not unfamiliar. It's pretty common. So, for example, in Seattle and in the Puget Sound area and the Pacific Northwest, when there was the burning of the longhouses that brought down so much of Indigenous community, it didn't vanquish it, but it definitely gave a devastating blow. And in the area where we lived, Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities were not thought of as places or community spaces that could thrive here, that could come back, that could have a resurgence. And so one part of this panel coming together is our work around food sovereignty and food justice locally. Unfortunately, the COVID pandemic revealed all the frailties in our systems. So as we responded to food insecurity and housing insecurity, there's a historical motif to look at, which is, why is there such high disproportionate rates for homelessness, for Native and for Black people and for Brown people in our region, in our area? And how can that be challenged by thinking about the land thoughtfully and carefully? And so as we do work, I know Wari is teaming up with local groups to do the Wari Teaching Garden and to talk about food sovereignty. This year, we're also working with Indigenous educators who think about not just that everyone should have access to nutritious, good food, but that also we should remember that many Indigenous communities weren't necessarily farmers. They worked creatively with the land, and it gave back, and it was enough. So as we start thinking about the new ways that people are redesigning life so that life is viable, because quite often we're looking at how life is not really viable. It's not viable during the pandemic because too many people are struggling materially. So in your closing thoughts, I think in a really beautiful way, along with diaspora and displacement, you've talked about collectivity and rootedness. So what are some closing thoughts that you want to give as a gift to the audience around what are ways that people can be rooted and have a sense of belonging and a meaningful connection to land and one another?
Oh, I guess I'll just jump in. I am a born and raised Seattleite. I think I said that at the beginning of the panel. And what I'm going to say is not necessarily race specific, but I think it answers your question, Davida, which is, well, in Seattleites have a thing where people talk about the Seattle freeze and say we're not super welcoming. And whether you've experienced that or believe it's true or not, but I've noticed that transplants, people who move here, have almost everybody that I know has found their own individual community, right? And I think there's something about finding a group of people that you feel safe with, that you commune with, that you do holidays with, that you are in your pod with. And I see that in all these different creative ways all throughout the city, from friends who are buying houses together, from people who like are co-living, to Queer the Land's new house that they have together. So I think that like people are finding community is really people who love you for who you are, who in your fullest self. And so if we keep thinking about that, Seattle as a place for that, I think that's an exciting possibility, because a lot of the pressures that you talked about, like why are Indigenous and Black folks among the most homeless? Well, we also know the homeless rise in Seattle is literally not due to what people like to think, which is like drug addiction or things like that they like to put on our homeless communities, but it's literally unaffordability. So the fact that this city and our county has made rental and housing so unaffordable, we've pushed the people who are already marginalized and we're making less to be more housing unstable, right? And so I think that once we actually really think about what does it mean for everybody to belong and feel safe and have their needs met, and reframe what it means for everybody to be together. Like, again, like I loved how Uba was talking about the history of kind of housing and single family housing and how it's just literally linked to colonialism. But if we actually think about everybody being able to actually have housing, which is why I mentioned I'm a democratic socialist, because I believe everybody deserves housing, food, and healthcare, then I think we can have a new paradigm about what it means to belong. And I think that we're already coming up with really creative ways to do that.
I loving all of it. Sauncha, Uba, what are your closing thoughts? And then I'll wind us down.
Yeah, I think throughout this hour, what we've been hearing is that it seems the odds are stacked against, for the lack of better word, a socially just future for land ownership, especially for people of color. But I also think that there is right now a narrow window of opportunity, especially given the racial reckoning, COVID impacts, and especially the economic impacts, and just seeing who stepped up during this time, and the government money did not come until a few months later. It was the village that came together. What were they being called? Mutual aids, right? That came together to feed and their neighbors, right? So I think that there's a narrow window of opportunity for the seeds of land ownership to grow. And as you were talking and asking the question around food sovereignty, and I did a quick kind of and research and a quick kind of Googling of who owns as farmland is concerned. Today, 8% of farms control over 40% of all farmland, and the average size of a farm now is 441 acres. And it increases every year as smaller farms buckle under the weight of the capital-intensive industrial agricultural model. And over 60% of the farm workers are people of color, largely we know are Latinos, while 98% of farmland are owned by white people. So that's about 50% as much as all the farmland owned by people of color. So this is just showing that the symptoms of this unjust land ownership pattern is, again, as your question alluded, manifesting on our food system and disproportionately impacting communities of color, as we talked about. But as I said, there's an opportunity right now to undo some of those, for people collectively to come together, to fundraise together, to crowdsource, to actually, garden together, as Wari and other groups are doing, and just meet the needs of these communities. And then just doing organizing. And like I said earlier, that I'm originally from Somalia. We've had over 30 years of war, and it has taken the collective, the village, to be able to just give back. And the economic of Somalia is sustained by the Somalis in the diaspora for the last 30 years. So what about using some of those tools, to be able to, you can't depend on the banks. You know, you can know all that if you see the Air Cares Act funding and see who it has gone to. It hasn't gone to BIPOC businesses. They've all, like, over 40% of Black-owned businesses have gone out of business in the last year. You know, so I think, like, we will have to continue doing what we have started doing collectively to really grow our own village so that we can thrive in place.
Thank you, Uba. Let's pass it to Sauncha, and then we'll wind down.
Yeah, so I guess I'll talk a little about food sovereignty. I haven't gotten around to that. So, like, I grew up in Alaska, and so I don't have harvesting rights down here. If I wanted to teach my daughter how to pick seaweed or dig for clams, I'd have to pay for the license. And I'm like, never, like, just out of principle. And then some of my friends in Alaska were like, just do it. And I'm like, well, I don't want to get, like, embroiled in this, like, 10-year Supreme Court battle over whether I could dig up some clams. And not only that, I wouldn't want to be, at the time I lived in Seattle, wouldn't want to be digging up clams in the Ship Canal, you know, like, it's not exactly the healthiest place. But it is important to acknowledge that the Duwamish River is a superfund, that when people fish there, those fish are so poisoned. And the EPA policies, a lot of time they will deem water clean because there's a safe level mercury if you have a single sardine once a week. And it's like, most Native people eat way more fish than that. And to declare that safe is not a great thing. So some of the ways that some people get around it is they make their own, like, orchards for harvesting. That way they don't have to worry about if it's their land, if it's not their land. And it's important to remember too, like, so this isn't going to apply directly inside the city of Seattle, but reservation land is in trust. They don't own that and straight out, they can't mortgage it. So they're also being left behind in that generational wealth, and they can't even mortgage their house for home improvements. And that's when you get these dilapidated houses with, you know, like, open roofs because they can't fix it. And it's important to remember our place in that landscape. Like, the Skagit Dam is going through its renewal process right now, and we are taking their food away. We have cut off their salmon, and we are doing it with a nice label of it's clean energy, but at what cost? So that's something we should be examining. And so this is just me on off work time as an Indigenous person, that the Duwamish don't have federal recognition. And some people just think that that means money, casino. It means so much more. It means they can't go to Northwest Indian College because they're not federally recognized unless they pay out-of-state tuition. So they would have to pay 3 times as much money to go there. They can't harvest salmon without paying for a license. They can't bring battles up in court because they're not recognized as a tribe. So it's really, I can't speak for the city of Seattle, but no action is action. And we are ducking our heads in the sand on this because it's too controversial. And that's action. That is a stance that we as a people have chosen and have said is okay. But my hopes for, like, that gets down. My hopes for the pandemic is, I think we have an amazing opportunity, like, from the second the pandemic hit, and then the summer protests, it reminded me of Derek Bell's interest conversion theory, that all of a sudden, like, we'd been asking for laptops for kids and we were told there was no money for laptop for kids. All of a sudden a pandemic hits and white kids don't have laptops, and now we have money for kids. Now we have extra unemployment, no drug tests or anything. All of these services happened, and we can do it. And I hope that that's something that we examine. This is an amazing opportunity to reset as a people and a country. I think we've seen that happen too in, like, the colleges in UW has stopped using standardized testing for getting in. And some people are like, why didn't they do it sooner? And I imagine that there were stakeholders who are like, no, we like our kids' test scores, but also, like, nobody can get their test done. So it's a perfect time to implement this. We have this great opportunity for social change. And we've kind of proven in the last year that it can happen if we work at it and if we sustain it. And I was so amazed about the protests this summer because everything was awful. But I felt like the pandemic gave us the opportunity to go out there and protest. You know, we either had work from home, so we had that flexibility to go out and protest. Although I didn't protest, I'm so sorry. I can't walk or be out in the sun. I'm from Alaska, it's hot. But I was very vocal. I was very vocal in my workplace. I was all over social media. Like I was like rabble rousing everywhere. And so it's like we had this opportunity to go out there for months on end and apply the pressure to hold people accountable, and people didn't have to put their jobs on the line and their health insurance, which I really feel like those are ways to try to keep us in line. There's a reason like other countries give it to people. You shouldn't be hold your health accountable to keeping your mouth shut. So very hopeful.
I couldn't ask for a better panel. Thank you so much for, one, just walking us so elegantly through the natural, ancestral, and social worlds that we live in and are part of. And also thank you for the magnificence of your love ethic, because the things that we did in this hour are not easy to do. And so I appreciate your hearts and your minds. I hope that each of you gets a chance to check out the Seattle Black Film Festival. And I also hope that we get to dig in the garden and spend time together in the city and keep dreaming together. Thank you so much. And handing it back to the festival.